The unwanted crown, burden of a 9-month reign. Settle down, find a comfortable place to rest your head, and let the gentle, slow cadence of history carry you into the quiet stillness of the night. Tonight, we journey back to the deep Middle Ages, to an era where the weight of a crown was often too heavy to bear, and where the greatest tragedy of a monarch was not a bloody death in battle, but a slow, quiet surrender to the inner self. Our story begins in the year 1422, a time of chilling stone castles, flickering tallow candles, and constant ambient dampness. The grand halls of Windsor Castle, though vast and filled with the echoes of history, were unusually subdued. The reason was both simple and deeply complex. The King of England had died. King Henry V, the great warrior, the victor of Agincourt, had succumbed to a mysterious illness, leaving behind a throne, a terrifyingly large seat of power, for a child barely old enough to recognize the sound of his own nurse's voice. Our subject is Henry, the only son of the legendary warrior king, and he was, at the time of his accession, precisely 9 months old. Picture this scene, not as a moment of great fanfare, but of profound, unsettling quiet. There were no trumpets for this coronation, only the hushed whispers of counselors worried about the legitimacy of a ruler who could not yet walk. The realm, stretched thin across England and parts of France, now rested on the small, unburdened shoulders of an infant. It is from this moment of stillness, of the transfer of power to someone entirely unaware of its existence, that the long, quiet tragedy of Henry's life began. The great seal of the realm, that massive waxen symbol of sovereignty, had to be stamped officially in the king's name. But how does an infant endorse the ruling of a kingdom? The counselors, a group of anxious, aging nobles, devised a method that perfectly symbolized the king's passivity. As the official documents of state were passed into law, the king himself, wrapped tightly in swaddling clothes, was brought into the council chamber. A counselor would gently hold the child's tiny, soft hand and guide it to scrawl a small, barely perceptible mark upon the parchment. Every signature was a forced, unconscious gesture. The king was governing the greatest empire in Western Europe, yet his consciousness was entirely consumed with the simple, necessary rhythm of the crib, waking, feeding, and sleeping. This infant king slept on average 20 hours a day. It was the natural rhythm of childhood, but it foreshadowed the defining characteristic of his adult life. The affairs of state, wars, treaties, taxes, and executions all unfolded around his tiny, silent form. The reality was that England was ruled by the council, by dukes and archbishops, and the king was simply a peaceful, sleeping symbol in the nursery. This environment of absolute power without absolute consciousness created a strange, gentle passivity in the young man. He never knew the exhilaration of taking power. It was merely given to him as a state of being, like the color of his eyes or the shape of his nose. He grew up timid, overly pious, and averse to the bloodshed and noise that defined his era. Where his father, Henry V, was a lion, our Henry was a lamb. As the years passed, the burden did not lift. If anything, the crown pressed harder. By the age of 16, Henry was not merely king in name. He was expected to rule actively, to lead, to decide. Yet the habit of passivity, of allowing others to guide his hand, had been established in his infancy. His mind, delicate and sensitive, seemed to crave the quietude of his youth, the long, uninterrupted silence of the deep sleep that had shielded him from the world's loud demands. He would listen to the endless debates in the council room, the harsh voices of his uncles, the Duke of Gloucester and the Duke of Bedford, arguing over policy and power. And his inclination was always to seek the simplest path, the least confrontational solution. He sought not to dominate, but to withdraw. The world wanted a king who slept 6 hours and fought 18. England had inherited a king who seemed to long for the peace of 20 hours of sleep, a king whose greatest ambition was simply to be left alone. This quiet internal withdrawal was the first subtle sign of the greater, profound stupor that would eventually define his life and plunge his kingdom into one of its bloodiest chapters. As the young King Henry VI moved from the nursery to the damped, chill halls of Westminster, he carried with him more than just the burden of 2 crowns. He carried a biological shadow. To understand Henry's delicate mental state, we must first gently turn our attention to his maternal grandfather, King Charles VI of France. This royal ancestor, known tragically as Charles the Mad, provided the historical genetic whisper that would eventually bloom into Henry's deep silence. King Charles VI was a man whose madness was spectacular and loud, a terrifying opposite to Henry's quiet withdrawal. Charles suffered from recurring episodes that lasted months, believing at one point that he was made entirely of glass. He would cry out if anyone approached, fearing he would shatter. He forbade his servants from touching him, forcing them to wrap him in thick blankets and cushioning his every step. The sound of glass, the clinking of a goblet, the crash of a window was enough to send the French court into a panic. This legacy of psychological instability, this Lancastrian anxiety, was a constant low-level static in the background of Henry's early life. Though his mother, Catherine of Valois, tried desperately to shield him from the whispers, the court knew the family history. Every quiet mood, every moment of distraction the young king displayed was measured against the specter of the Glass King. The weight of this expectation that he might, at any moment, descend into the terrifying gaiety of his grandfather's madness made Henry exceptionally timid and excessively withdrawn. This timidity was mistaken for piety. Henry was obsessed with devout religious practices, not out of a dramatic passion, but out of a desperate need for order and quietude. His chambers were Spartan, almost monastic. He dismissed courtiers who wore scandalously short garments, not out of moral outrage, but because the gaudy colors and loud fabrics were too stimulating, too jarring to his sensitive nerves. He sought a life of dull, beautiful routine, a routine that promised to keep the chaos of his inherited mind safely locked away.
In those years, the actual governance of the kingdom was handled by the Regency Council, a massive, slow-moving bureaucratic machine of dukes and archbishops. These men, loud, ambitious, and practical, were the direct contrast point to the quiet king. They argued for hours over the smallest details of foreign policy, taxes, and appointments. Henry, seated silently upon his throne, would watch these conflicts unfold, his head resting lightly in his hand. He was a silent audience to the constant clamor of politics, learning early that silence was safer than action, and that the real power operated best when the king was merely a sleeping symbol. The king's only escape was books and blueprints. He founded Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, not as a grand display of power, but as a commitment to peace and learning. Picture the quiet hours he spent with architects, poring over the fine, precise lines of a chapel design. Here, in the ordered world of geometry and faith, Henry found a brief, gentle peace, a stillness that the messy, loud reality of his inherited kingdom could never offer him. But outside the silent walls of his schools, the world was loudly falling apart. The greatest and perhaps most boring tragedy of Henry's reign was the slow, inevitable loss of France. It wasn't a sudden cinematic defeat, it was a decades-long gradual surrender of territory, money, and morale, the kind of historical failure that moves too slowly to be dramatic, yet too profoundly to be ignored. When Henry VI died, the English held the key territories in France. By the time Henry VI was an adult, the situation had become a grinding, expensive stalemate. The narration of this decline is designed to be as non-intrusive as possible, focusing on the sheer logistical monotony of the war. Imagine the endless stream of official correspondence that flooded Westminster, documented on heavy, coarse parchment. These were not letters describing heroic charges. They detailed the exhaustion of funds, the lack of pay for garrisons, and the endless difficulties of moving supplies across the cold, damp channel. Each letter was a small, quiet pinprick in the national treasury, slowly draining England's financial lifeblood. We focus on the strategic losses narrated calmly. The city of Rouen, once a beacon of English power, was not lost in a huge siege, but surrendered after endless political maneuvering and a lack of resources. The narration traces the long, winding roads taken by diplomatic parties, traveling for months just to sign a treaty that ceded land. The quiet giving up was far more characteristic of Henry's reign than any heroic taking. The diplomatic missions were a parade of failures. Courtiers spent fortunes on velvet robes and expensive banquets, only to return home having achieved nothing but the extension of another fragile, doomed truce. Henry, always seeking peace, was constantly fooled by French negotiators. He yearned for the conflict to simply stop, and in his desperation for stillness, he gave away what his father had bled for. The atmosphere in Henry's English court was heavy with this failure. The nobles who had fought in France, men like the Duke of Gloucester, grew bitter, watching their hard-won prestige dissolve in the quiet, gentle atmosphere of Henry's passive rule. Every penny spent on the costly, complex logistics of a failing campaign was a penny not spent securing the border at home or reinforcing the king's authority.
The true drain was not the occasional battle, but the continuous financial burden. The mundane, boring necessity of maintaining garrisons in Calais, Bordeaux, and Normandy. The English crown was running on perpetual debt, a complex and confusing system of loans and defaulted payments that only the most dedicated scholars would dare to analyze. This financial decay was a silent, internal rot, and it was the primary cause of the political instability that would soon crash over the king's head. And as the political landscape shifted, subtly but relentlessly, Henry, who had always sought refuge in his silent piety and his long hours of peace, was about to face the ultimate test, a mental breakdown so complete it would finally grant him the deepest, longest silence he had ever craved. The great stupor was coming, and it would change the face of England forever, all while the king slept. As Henry matured, the quiet, internal forces that shaped him began to define his rule. He was, by all accounts, a benevolent monarch, a man utterly unsuited for the brutal, ambitious world of 15th century politics. He focused on his piety and his aversion to conflict, creating a strangely tranquil atmosphere at the very heart of the turbulent court. This is where we linger now, examining the non-stimulating details of his daily life that only magnified his passivity. Henry's daily routine was a study in stillness. While other kings were roused at dawn by the clamor of hunting horns or the clang of armor, Henry preferred the quiet ritual of matins and lauds. He spent hours in prayer, not for show, but for genuine, deep-seated spiritual comfort. The simple, repetitive Latin chants provided a soothing, predictable rhythm that the chaos of court life lacked. His piety was his shield, his refusal to be drawn into the loud, vulgar disputes that often stained the reputation of his nobles. His soft heart was evident in his deep aversion to warfare and violence. He would recoil visibly from the sight of blood and would actively work to reduce the harshness of justice, favoring mercy and quiet mediation over fiery retribution. In a world where nobility defined itself by the size of its retinue and the sharpness of its sword, Henry's greatest strength was his gentleness. He carried a quiet fragility, an almost priestly air that made him entirely unthreatening, a characteristic that sadly only encouraged the more ambitious and aggressive nobles to see him not as a king, but as a vacancy. We trace the subtle details of his preference for silence. He disliked loud music at meals, preferring a small choir that sang soft liturgical verses. He preferred simple, unadorned fabrics, shunning the blinding silken flash of continental fashion. These choices were not merely stylistic, they were psychological needs. They represented his constant, conscious effort to turn down the volume of the world, to keep the external stimuli low enough so that the subtle internal chaos of his own mind, the inherited madness, would not be triggered. His passivity was, in many ways, an exhausting defensive maneuver against himself. He often walked alone in the quiet gardens of Sheen or Eltham, staring fixedly at the moss on the stone or the clouds passing slowly overhead. The royal clerks would often find him here, absorbed in his own stillness, and they would wait patiently and quietly until he softly acknowledged their presence. The machinery of the kingdom would literally slow to his pace, a pace that was gentle, deliberate, and designed to help a restless mind find rest. This benevolence, however, soon attracted a shadow. Into Henry's quiet, controlled world strode a woman of fiery passion and decisive action, Margaret of Anjou. Their marriage in 1445 was supposed to bring peace with France, but it brought only a new, intensified storm of intrigue to the English court. We slow the pace here, allowing the complex political drama to unfold gently, like a very long, detailed look at a silent tableau. Margaret was the antithesis of Henry. She was beautiful, intelligent, and fiercely political, everything the passive king was not. She did not seek quietude. She sought power, not for herself, but to defend her gentle husband and the fragile stability of their son's future. The nobles who had grown accustomed to manipulating the sleepy, compliant king found themselves suddenly confronted by the sharp, determined queen. The royal court, always a viper's nest of gossip, now became divided into two distinct quiet camps. Those who clung to the passive authority of the king, and those who saw the energetic decisiveness of the queen as the only hope for the throne. The conflicts were often not loud, dramatic clashes, but slow, detailed political battles fought through the quiet maneuvering of titles, lands, and appointments. We examined the subtle but constant tension in the royal chambers. When Henry was present, he would often defer entirely to Margaret, resting his chin on his hand as she handled correspondence and directed ministers. His passive acceptance was a source of great stress for the Duke of York, the king's cousin and heir apparent, who watched Margaret's power grow, effectively rendering Henry not just a symbolic ruler, but an actively sidelined one. This tension created a suffocating atmosphere of distrust. Imagine the evening banquets, not as scenes of boisterous merriment, but as long, tense affairs where conversation was guarded and every glance was measured. The wine was poured slowly. The music was subdued. Everyone was waiting for the king to retreat, for his eyelids to grow heavy, so that the real politics, the quiet, whispered court intrigue, could begin under the cover of the queen's vigilant eye.
This chapter details the slow, unfolding political drama, focusing on the bureaucratic changes, the transfer of power from the old guard to Margaret's favorites. It is a slow, detailed look at the political drama, emphasizing the underlying currents of anxiety rather than explosive action. The more active the queen became, the deeper Henry sank into his own inner quietude, making his eventual mental collapse seem less of a sudden event and more of an inevitable, quiet escape. Amidst the spiraling political chaos, Henry dedicated himself to the creation of two lasting, peaceful structures that provided a profound contrast to the turbulence of his life: Eton College and King's College, Cambridge. These weren't mere architectural projects, they were sanctuaries built from his need for order, silence, and permanence. We focus here on the calming architectural details and the deep, abiding quiet of scholarly pursuit. Picture the dusty, detailed blueprints spread across a heavy oak table in a quiet room far from the court. Henry found a deep, meditative calm in the precision of geometry and masonry. He could spend hours discussing the exact curve of a vaulted ceiling or the placement of a cloister, areas of life where the rules were fixed and predictable, unlike the treacherous nature of men. The foundation of Eton College in particular was an act of profound, quiet devotion. It was designed to be a place of scholarly contemplation, a sanctuary where young boys could be educated in pious obscurity, far from the ambition and corruption of the capital. The narration slows down to describe the building materials. the cold, smooth surfaces of the stone, the gentle echo in the chapel, the organized symmetry of the quadrangle. These details are designed to soothe the listener, grounding the story in the quiet permanence of architecture. Henry's personal involvement was meticulous. He didn't just donate funds, he dictated the precise liturgical schedule for the choir, ensuring the hours of the day were marked by soft, repetitive chants. The foundation was a quiet pursuit of knowledge, a search for a perfect, ordered life that he himself could never live. His greatest architectural passion was King's College Chapel in Cambridge. This structure, which would take generations to complete, was his attempt to build heaven on earth, a high, intricate space that would dwarf the noise and pettiness of man. Imagine the serene sound of the mason's quiet chipping, the rhythmic sound of stone being laid, building slowly, centimeter by centimeter, towards an impossible height. This slow-motion construction project mirrors the slow movement of the historical narrative itself, a long, arduous process built on hope and devotion, a temporary respite from the coming storm. He sought peace through these buildings, but his efforts to create external order only highlighted the growing internal chaos of the kingdom. The funds for his peaceful colleges often had to be diverted to pay for the failing French wars or to settle the angry debts of the nobility. The king was building sanctuaries of silence with one hand, while the other was dragged unwillingly into the deafening prelude to civil war. The contrast was exhausting, and the body and mind that longed for 20 hours of sleep were finally beginning to give way. The stage was set for the great stupor, the ultimate complete withdrawal from the world. The summer of 1453 was hot and heavy, burdened by the news of final catastrophic losses in France. The last major English territory, the Duchy of Aquitaine, had finally fallen. This final failure, the quiet end of a dream that had lasted over 3 centuries, was simply too much for the already fragile king to bear. The noise of failure had become deafening, and Henry's mind sought the only refuge it truly knew: absolute stillness. The exact moment the transformation occurred is lost to the precise chaos of history, but the consensus points to a day in August 1453. The king was at his manor, perhaps holding court, or perhaps simply sitting quietly when the final, unbearable piece of news arrived. It wasn't a violent event. There was no screaming, no sudden physical collapse. Instead, Henry simply ceased to participate. Imagine the scene, narrated in hushed tones. The king was observed to be sitting, perhaps staring blankly at the ornate pattern of the tapestry before him. A courtier spoke to him, seeking his signature on a routine document, or perhaps merely asking about his health. Henry offered no response. No flicker of recognition crossed his face. His eyes were open, but empty, looking out without seeing. The initial reaction was confusion, then a subtle, growing fear. Was the king merely ill, tired, or had the inherited shadow of the Glass King finally claimed him? They spoke louder, they touched his arm, they brought his favorite scribe to read to him. Nothing. The king was fully, physically present, seated squarely upon his throne, yet his mind had vanished overnight. He had slipped into a state of catatonia, a profound psychological break characterized by a terrifying stillness. He was mute. He was unresponsive. If you gently lifted his arm, it would remain suspended for a long moment before slowly drifting back down. The silence that fell over the throne was not just the absence of his voice. It was the chilling realization that the single sovereign mind of the entire kingdom had gone completely dark. The king had finally achieved the ultimate unbroken sleep he had always longed for. The machinery of state ground to a hesitant, terrified halt. The king's condition persisted for over a year, creating a bizarre and unstable vacuum at the heart of the English government. This was the year of unknowing, a period where one of the most critical events in the history of the House of Lancaster occurred entirely without the king's knowledge:
the birth of his heir, Edward of Westminster. The Queen, Margaret of Anjou, desperate for her husband to return, tried everything. She spoke to him constantly, read letters to him, and brought musicians to play soft, gentle hymns. When their son was born in October 1453, just a couple of months after the king's collapse, Margaret brought the infant prince to Henry's chamber. Picture the small, quiet room, heavy with the scent of medicinal herbs and the tension of waiting. Margaret laid their son, the future of the dynasty, gently across Henry's lap. The infant stirred and cooed. The king's eyes remained fixed and empty. He did not acknowledge the child. He did not touch him. He offered no flicker of recognition to the son born to protect his throne. He was a father entirely unaware of his own son's existence. This profound stillness defined life at court. Henry's catatonic state was contagious, filling the palaces with a muted, perpetual anxiety. The counselors whispered in the corridors, fearing to raise their voices lest they disturb the stillness of the royal chambers. The government operated in a legal and emotional void. Every decision was made with a chilling question hanging overhead. What if the king never wakes? During this long period, the king would sometimes be moved, carried gently from one room to the next like a fragile statue. He was attended constantly, fed by hand with soft purees, and washed with the utmost care. He required no entertainment, issued no commands, and felt no pain. He was merely an existence, breathing quietly, sleeping deeply, a living testament to the sheer, overwhelming fatigue of sovereignty. This was the greatest, longest sleep in English history, and it was a deep, unsettling peace. The great intellectual challenge of the stupor fell to the king's physicians, the most learned men of the age. Their attempts to understand and treat Henry provide a calm, detailed examination of medicine of the medieval mind, a fascinating look at the limits of historical knowledge. The king's physicians offered various slow-paced theories. Some attributed the malady to melancholy, a profound imbalance of the four humors caused by too much black bile. Others whispered of divine punishment or sorcery. The treatments they prescribed were elaborate, non-intrusive, and ultimately futile. Imagine the calm, methodical process of their proposed cures. Herbal vapors. The king's room was filled with the gentle, persistent aroma of calming herbs like lavender and rosemary, designed to soothe the overheated brain. Dietary extremes. He was given soft, easily digestible foods thought to reduce the internal fire of the humors. His diet was deliberately bland, adding to the monotonous, sleepy quality of his existence. The unstirring watch. Physicians would sit for hours by his bedside, watching for any minute change, a twitch of the eyelid, a slight shift in posture. These long, patient vigils of medieval doctors trying to observe an unresponsive mind are themselves an exercise in historical calm, perfect for lulling the listener. Crucially, the doctors had no framework for a psychological break of this magnitude. They could find no fever, no obvious physical injury. This led many, including the influential Duke of York, to conclude that the king was simply incapable of ruling, a political diagnosis rather than a medical one. The detailed, calm examination of the medieval medical process ensures that even this desperate chapter of the story remains soothing. It highlights the profound helplessness of the most learned men of the age when faced with the stillness of the human mind. Henry had withdrawn to a place where no herb, no chant, and no political appeal could reach him. His silence had become the single most powerful force in the kingdom, setting the stage for the dramatic, loud conflict that would define the rest of his unhappy life. He was sleeping, but England was preparing to wake up to war. This brings us to the next pivotal section of your historical narrative, the king's recovery and the immediate violent consequences of his long absence. We will cover Part 4, The Waking and the War, chapters 10, 11, and 12.
maintaining the necessary, soothing, slow-paced narrative required for your boring history for sleeping audience. The year of unknowing finally drew to a close during the Christmas season of 1454. The atmosphere in the royal apartments, usually heavy with medicinal fumes and muted fear, was now thick with the artificial cheer of the holiday. And then, as quietly and unexpectedly as his collapse, the king returned. The moment of awakening was not a glorious, dramatic one, but a sudden, gentle moment of clarity observed by a physician. Henry VI, who had sat mute and motionless for 16 months, suddenly spoke. His first words were reportedly a query about a chaplain who had been serving him before his stupor. He was not grandly demanding the state of the realm. He was inquiring about a simple, quiet administrative detail of his household. The transition was so subtle that the attendants initially mistook his words for a sleepy mutter. But Henry was awake. He recognized his queen, Margaret, and his trusted attendants. Yet the shock of his return was almost as terrifying as his absence. He did not immediately comprehend the vast new reality that had unfolded while he slept. We slow the narrative here to focus on the king's slow, bewildered realization of the changes. The first major revelation was his son, Prince Edward, who was now over a year old. The queen brought the boy to him, and this time Henry looked at him with gentle recognition. He held his son, but his reaction was not one of overwhelming fatherly joy, but of a kind of distant, shocked surprise. He had slept through his child's infancy. The greater shock, however, was political. While Henry had been absent, the Duke of York had ruled as protector of the realm, essentially taking his place. Henry's return meant that York's power vanished overnight. The king, in his gentle, almost childlike clarity, immediately tried to restore the old order, demanding a return to the peaceful, flawed governance that had existed before his stupor. But the pieces of the political board had been dramatically rearranged. Henry had awakened to a quiet room, only to realize the entire house around him was now engulfed in the roaring flames of civil war. The War of the Roses had begun. His moment of peace was over. The moment Henry awoke, the quiet power struggle that had simmered beneath the surface of the court boiled over. The chief antagonist was Richard, Duke of York, a cousin who felt he was the true, competent successor to the throne. Our focus here is detailing the political maneuverings during Henry's long incapacity, narrated with the gentle pace of a slow chess match. While Henry slept, York had seized the reins of power under the title of Protector. He used this time not for aggressive expansion, but for quiet, bureaucratic consolidation. He filled key positions in the Treasury and the Council with his own loyal men. Every signature affixed to a document during the king's absence was a slow, deliberate move on the political board, all done without the slightest input from the sleeping monarch. When Henry awakened and dismissed York, the Duke did not roar in protest. He withdrew calmly, strategically. This period of rivalry was characterized by tense, controlled diplomacy, where the threat of violence was always present but rarely enacted overtly. The king, driven by Queen Margaret, sought to dismantle York's structure, replacing his appointments with those loyal to the queen. It was a tedious back-and-forth process of bureaucratic reversals. The narration emphasizes the quiet, chilling reality that the kingdom no longer knew whom to obey. Was it the gentle, pious king whose mind had just been absent for over a year? Or was it the strong, effective duke who had provided stability during the chaos? The uncertainty was what drove the final tragic slide into conflict. This was a war fought not with massive armies initially, but with the quiet, devastating efficiency of paperwork and patronage, slowly eroding the foundations of loyalty. The first flashpoint, the First Battle of St. Albans, was a sharp, brutal shock to the system. It was a brief, localized conflict, but it achieved a terrifying goal: the death of several of Henry's key allies. Henry himself was captured. In his usual manner, he simply allowed himself to be led away, exhibiting no resistance, no fighting spirit, merely a profound, sad acceptance of his fate. Even in the midst of open conflict, the king sought stillness. The next phase of Henry's life was defined by flight and capture, turning the sovereign into the fugitive king. After the Lancasterians suffered major defeats, Henry, guided by his fierce Queen Margaret, was forced to flee, often in great haste and in profound discomfort. This is the gentle story of his flight, emphasizing the solitude and the quiet despair of a deposed ruler. Imagine the king's retinue, no longer a grand parade, but a small, terrified band of loyalists riding through the cold, rainy countryside of northern England and Scotland. The narrative focuses on the small, miserable details of exile, the dampness of the small, borrowed castles, the thin, cheap meals eaten quickly, the constant low thrum of fear and uncertainty. Henry, the king who despised warfare and loved order, was now subject to the most disorderly life imaginable. His time in Scotland was one of deep, almost monastic quiet. He was a refugee, often housed in remote, cold monasteries. While Queen Margaret tirelessly sought foreign support, Henry retreated into his customary inner stillness. He was far from the noise of London, and in this way his exile provided a perverse form of the peace he had always craved. He spent his time praying, reading, and contemplating, a lonely exile who was finally, briefly free of the daily demands of the throne. But this peace was not to last. In 1465, after years on the run, Henry was betrayed and captured near Clitheroe. He was brought back to London, not to his palace, but to the Tower of London. He was imprisoned, but not harshly. The new Yorkist king, Edward IV, treated Henry as a sacred object, a symbol that had to be contained, not harmed.
Henry's time in the Tower was another period of deep, involuntary rest. His new life was one of quiet, predictable solitude, guards, daily meals, and endless silence. The king who slept 20 hours a day was now confined to a small, dark room, forced into a state of quietude by his enemies. This phase marks the ultimate withdrawal, the complete surrender of action, setting the scene for his unexpected short return to power. Excellent. We have arrived at the final, somber section of the story. We will now cover Part 5, the final rest, chapters 13, 14, and 15, detailing the king's anticlimactic return to power, his quiet death, and the lasting legacy of his passive reign. This concluding section maintains the soothing, reflective tone required for your boring history for sleeping niche, providing a sense of closure as the listener drifts off. History is rarely neat, and sometimes a quiet tragedy is briefly interrupted by a loud, desperate flourish. That was the case for Henry VI. After 5 years of peaceful imprisonment in the Tower, he was dragged back onto the political stage for the moment of restoration in 1470. This was not a triumphant return, but a temporary, desperate maneuver by his ambitious cousin, the Earl of Warwick, who sought to use the meek king as a puppet. The return to the throne was short and utterly anticlimactic. Henry was taken from his quiet, predictable cell, dressed in royal robes, and presented to the London public. The people, tired of years of civil war, cheered politely. Henry, however, showed no enthusiasm. He was a passive observer at his own restoration, moving and speaking as if in a daze, clearly yearning for the reliable solitude of his prison cell. He spent his final 6 months on the throne moving through the motions of governance, issuing decrees that were entirely written by Warwick and Queen Margaret. He was a beautiful, tragic figurehead, the literal embodiment of a crown briefly regained but utterly unwanted. The kingdom, meanwhile, was exhausted, and Henry's brief reappearance only heightened the sense of instability. The focus here is on the quiet internal conflict,
the king's palpable preference for silence over the noise of the court. He would often sit in the throne room, seemingly listening to the debates, but his mind had already retreated. He gave his consent with a barely audible whisper, his body a frail, temporary holder of a title that had brought him nothing but distress. This phase served only to underscore the sad truth. Henry was simply not built for the demands of kingship. His brief, uncomfortable restoration was the final, inevitable push toward his true and permanent rest. The second reign of Henry VI lasted barely 6 months. The Yorkist king, Edward IV, returned with an army, and after the decisive Battle of Tewkesbury, where Henry's son and heir, Prince Edward, was killed, the Lancastrian cause was extinguished. Henry was returned to the Tower of London, but this time the purpose was final. The exact circumstances of his death are shrouded in the subdued accounts of history, but the result was peace. On the night of May 21, 1471, the king died quietly in his cell in the Wakefield Tower. Whether by natural causes or, more likely, by quiet order, the king who sought 20 hours of sleep a day finally achieved eternal rest. The narrative lingers gently on the atmosphere of the tower on that night. No fanfare, no public spectacle, just the sound of the guard's soft footsteps and the cold, damped stone walls. His death was a final, complete, and quiet end of the Lancaster line. The silence surrounding his passing was profound, a stark contrast to the loud theatrical deaths of other medieval monarchs. His body was briefly displayed to the public to prove he was truly gone and not merely sleeping again, but even this was a subdued affair. His face, freed from the lifelong anxiety of the crown, was reported peaceful, bearing a quiet, gentle dignity in death that he rarely achieved in life. He was buried initially without ceremony, moved and removed over the following decades, a final physical restlessness for a soul that had always yearned for stillness. As we close our story and prepare to let the soothing echoes of history drift you into sleep, we consider the lasting impact of the sleeping king. Henry VI, the man who reigned not by action but by absence, inadvertently reshaped the course of England by creating a vacuum that led to a new era. Henry's story teaches us that passivity is its own kind of power. His gentle, pious nature, coupled with his long stupor, revealed a critical weakness in the English feudal system. The monarchy was only as strong as the mind that led it. The ensuing War of the Roses, born from the political vacuum created by his sleep, ultimately led to the rise of the Tudors, a dynasty that would ruthlessly centralize power and ensure that no English monarch would ever again be allowed to be so quietly passive. His physical legacy remains in the enduring stones of Eton College and King's College Chapel. These beautiful, silent sanctuaries, built from his need for order and quiet, stand as his true monuments, places of learning, contemplation, and peace, the very things the king valued above the clamor of the throne. Now, as the king has finally found his permanent rest, we invite you to do the same. Let the quiet echoes of his long, sad, and peaceful history lull you into a deep, restorative sleep. Good night.